He remembered waking into darkness, not a natural darkness, but an engineered void where even his thoughts seemed muffled. His eyelids opened, but sight didn't change. The absence of light was complete, oppressive, absolute. He tried to move his arms, but they were locked in place. No chains, no cuffs, just invisible force pinning him like a specimen. He opened his mouth to scream, but heard nothing, not even his own breathing. The horrifying realization crept in. He couldn't hear himself because there was no sound at all. His existence had become silent, utterly, chillingly silent. He didn't know how long he floated there. Seconds, hours, maybe years. The mind began to gnaw at itself in the void, searching for something to cling to. He tried to remember his name, his home, the face of someone he loved. But each memory flickered like a candle in the void, as if something were feeding on them. Fear came slowly at first, then violently. What if he wasn't alone? What if something watched him in that darkness? Something that didn't breathe, didn't blink, didn't rush, didn't feel. That was when he sensed it, an unblinking presence. A faint green glow finally appeared, slicing through the black like a surgical incision. He thought he saw movement, cold, metallic, silent. The Necron didn't speak. It didn't need to. Their presence radiated a logic so ancient and alien, it made human instinct feel like a primitive flicker. He felt something inside him being examined, not his body, but his consciousness. It was as though the machine was peeling apart his mind like layers of data, searching for patterns, extracting meaning and discarding sentiment. His fear was irrelevant. His memories were irrelevant. His humanity was irrelevant. The silence became a form of suffocation, not physical, but psychological. Without sound, the mind turned inward. He began to hear echoes. Were they real or imagined? Footsteps that weren't footsteps. Whispers with no language. The memory of his mother's voice, or something mimicking it. The Necrons didn't break the body. They broke perception. They twisted familiar sensations into alien distortions. In that timeless void, he felt himself dissolving, first as a soldier, then as a man, and finally as a self. He wondered if this was torture or simply a process, like dismantling a machine. There came a moment, he could not say when terror changed into resignation. He realized the horrifying truth. The Necrons did not torture him out of malice. They did not care whether he wept, screamed, or begged. They weren't predators or sadists. They were archivists, cold, methodical, tireless. To them, he was not a prisoner. He was a data source, a consciousness to be deconstructed, a living memory bank to be emptied. And as he felt his last recollection slip away, his brother's laugh, his childhood, his very sense of I am, the silence inside the tomb became something eternal, something endless, something he would never escape. To understand his captors, one must understand the Necrons, not as monsters, but as remnants of a civilization older than humanity's first dream. They were once flesh, once mortal, once plagued by fear of death. In their desperation, they traded their organic bodies for metal immortality, thinking it freedom. Instead, they entombed their souls inside machine shells, losing sensation, losing emotion, losing everything except perfect memory. Over millions of years, they awoke from tomb worlds, cold and calculating, with no concept of mercy, because mercy requires empathy, and empathy was the first sacrifice they made. Unlike the Imperium or even the sadistic forces of chaos, the Necrons do not torture for pleasure or punishment. Their cruelty is accidental, a side effect of efficiency. They see biological beings the same way a scientist sees bacteria, something to observe, to dissect, to study. When they capture a human, it isn't an act of conquest or anger. It is categorization. They have a clinical fascination with consciousness, memory, neural impulse, instinct, emotion, all the things they willingly discarded. Their torture is exploration. Their methods are experiments. Their cities, their tomb complexes, are not built for habitation, but for function. Rows upon rows of stasis chambers hum with silent power. Quantum entanglement scanners process neural activity. Reality anchoring fields prevent psychic interference. Every structure is precise, symmetrical, optimized. No wasted space, no randomness, no softness. These tombs are not prisons of punishment. They are vaults of intelligence. Every captured mind is stored like data, indexed, preserved in silence. Life and death are irrelevant. Consciousness alone matters. To them, humans are noisy creatures, too emotional, too instinct-driven, too unpredictable. They study us as a forgotten species studies fossils. And yet, somewhere within their timeless logic lies a shadow of longing, a ghost of curiosity. Psychologically, they are drawn to what they abandoned, the chaos of feeling. They cannot feel fear, but they dissect it. They cannot love, but they examine the neural recordings of love. They cannot dream, but they surgically observe the human unconscious. What humans experience as agony, Necrons experience as analysis. So when a prisoner awakens inside a Necron tomb, they are not entering a dungeon, they are entering a laboratory. The silence is not meant to terrify, but to isolate variables. The sensory deprivation is not punishment, but calibration. The extraction of memory is not sadism, but research. The Necrons do not whisper threats, or mock their victims, or revel in despair. They simply watch, measure, record, and in doing so, they inflict a form of suffering far worse than intentional cruelty, because it is completely impersonal. To be tortured by someone who hates you is horrifying, but to be tortured by someone who doesn't care whether you exist at all, that is horror beyond comprehension. The first thing he felt upon arriving in the tomb was the stillness, the oppressive, suffocating stillness of a place untouched by the universe. There was no hum of machinery, no vibration of systems, no shifting of air. The silence was so complete, it felt unnatural, as if the world itself had held its breath. The walls around him were smooth metallic obsidian, etched with geometric glyphs that seemed to pulse faintly with green energy. They didn't illuminate the chamber so much as define it, like boundaries of a digital space. He floated, yet not in water or air. He floated in a stasis field that held him perfectly centered. His body was frozen in a fixed posture, but he felt no weight, no pressure. It was like being suspended in the void of space, yet still anchored by something unseen. The tomb chamber stretched around him, vast and cathedral-like, with rows of other stasis sarcophagi containing forms, some human, some xenos, some unidentifiable. but all of them were immobilized in the same perfect silence. He could not turn his head, but he could see enough to understand that the Necrons designed their prisons with mathematical precision. Everything was aligned with haunting symmetry, the sarcophagi spaced evenly, the glyphs positioned at exact intervals, the floor divided into flawless squares of metal plating. There was no randomness, no imperfection. The environment was so ordered, it felt inhuman. Not hateful, just impossibly cold. A geometry of captivity. Occasionally, faint ripples of pale green light would sweep across the chamber, passing over the suspended prisoners. These waves were silent and slow, moving like scanning beams. And each time they crossed his body, he felt a microsecond of static inside his brain, like a needle of electricity threading through his thoughts. It was not pain, it was intrusion. He sensed that the Necrons were taking inventory, mapping neural pathways, evaluating emotional response, assessing resistance. His mind was being read like text. He tried again to speak, to produce any sound, but nothing left his throat. There was no echo, no vibration, not even the sensation of his own voice. The Necron tomb eliminated more than just noise. It removed feedback. A prisoner could not hear their own breathing, heartbeat, swallowing, or movement. The effect was terrifying. Without sound, one could not prove existence. The body's internal noises, the fundamental indicators of being alive, were erased. He felt like a ghost inside his own skin. Lights flickered in patterns across the ceiling, if it could be called a ceiling. It looked more like a mechanical sky, shifting in configurations that no human eye could interpret. Sometimes he thought he saw shapes moving through the upper shadows, Necron constructs suspended on rails, or drones gliding like silent insects. They passed information between themselves with bursts of binary energy. No speech, no command. A language of pure data, incomprehensible and uncaring. He could also sense other minds nearby, although sense was the wrong word. It was more like awareness without connection. He knew there were others trapped, hundreds, maybe thousands, yet he could not feel their panic or despair. The isolation field locked every consciousness into its own sealed chamber. Even if bodies occupied the same physical space, no one could reach out. No one could share suffering. Every mind was a solitary island, drowning in its own silent crisis. Below him, something stirred. The floor panel shifted open with the elegance of clockwork, revealing sublayers of machinery and energy conduits. When Necron forms emerged, tall, skeletal constructs with eyes burning green, they did not walk, they glided. Their movements were as fluid as shadow and as precise as surgery. They paused before each suspended prisoner, performing silent evaluations. When one passed beneath him, its gaze locked onto his. He felt nothing in that stare. No pity, no cruelty, only calculation. Eventually, mechanical tendrils emerged from the air itself, thin, luminous filaments that phased in and out of physical visibility. They touched the side of his head with surgical softness, sliding into the skin without breaking it, threading directly into nerves and memory. He couldn't scream, couldn't resist, couldn't even close his eyes. The environment itself restrained reaction. The prison did not require force. It required only control, and the Necrons had perfected it. And so inside the tomb, he realized that the terror did not come from violence or visible threat. It came from the sterile impersonality of it all. There were no guards shouting orders, no interrogators demanding answers, no instruments of pain left in the open. There was only the abyss of silence, the mathematical symmetry of the chamber, and the cold machinery probing his consciousness. The Necron prison was not a place built to hurt the body, only to unmake the mind. A place where living beings became datasets, where memory became currency, where identity was reduced to code. And as the filaments sank deeper into his thoughts, he understood that he had not been captured by enemies, but by archivists of eternity. Isolation began not as a sudden shock, but as a creeping dissolution of reality. The prisoner first noticed that his sense of time began to warp. Minutes stretched into hours, then into eternities. Without light cycles, without sound, without movement, his brain lost the external markers that made time coherent. Seconds became immeasurable. He could not tell if he had been there for a day or a decade. The Necrons understood this effect intimately. They engineered the stasis environment specifically to destroy temporal perception. Then came the optical degradation. He could see the chamber, but what he saw began to subtly shift. The glyphs flickered in patterns that made no logical sense. Sometimes they elongated into impossible shapes. Sometimes they rotated without movement. Sometimes they appeared to be behind his vision rather than in front. It wasn't hallucination. It was the Necrons manipulating the visual input, feeding false signals into the optic nerve, forcing the brain to question the authenticity of sight. Reality itself became unreliable. Next, the mind attacked itself. Deprived of sensory stimulus, the human brain begins to fill the void with self-generated imagery. At first, it was harmless. Memories replaying, familiar places resurfacing. But then those memories distorted. The faces of loved ones twisted into grotesque shapes. Familiar voices became garbled echoes. The childhood home became a maze of impossible corridors. The brain, desperate for input, created nightmares built from fear and fragments. The Necron prison did not deliver horror. It coaxed the prisoner's own mind into producing it. He began to hear sounds that did not exist. Footsteps on metal flooring, the distant rush of wind that didn't blow, whispering voices in languages that were not human. Sometimes he heard someone calling his name, a relative, a friend, a commander. But when he tried to respond, the voice would dissolve into static. Then another would speak, then another. A chorus of ghosts that were either hallucinations or psychic remnants of other victims. In the tomb, the boundary between internal thought and external sound vanished. The most horrifying part was when the hallucinations took form as tactile sensation. He felt fingers brush against his arm, but the arm didn't move. He felt something crawl across his skin, but there was nothing there. He felt breath on the back of his neck, but there was no air. These phantom sensations were unbearable because they had no source. The Necrons had discovered that terror doesn't require physical touch. It only requires the brain believing that touch exists. His identity began to erode. He tried to hold on to his name, but sometimes it slipped away. He tried to recall his age, his birthplace, but the details blurred. He tried to remember his purpose, his rank, his mission, but his mind produced blankness. In total isolation, the self cannot survive intact. The Necrons knew this. They didn't need to torture muscles or organs. They simply needed to starve the mind of affirmation, until the victim's self-awareness decayed into doubt and fragmentation. Eventually, thoughts began looping endlessly. A single memory would repeat like a stuck cog. A question would echo without answer. A phrase would replay in his mind until it lost meaning. He would think, "How long have I been here?" And his brain would produce no answer. He would think, "What is real?" And the question would consume itself. The Necrons did not bind their prisoners physically. They bound them psychologically, chaining their cognition to endless cycles of uncertainty. Worst of all was the silence, because it became a presence. When there are no sounds, the brain becomes hyper-attuned to the absence of sound. Silence becomes a texture, a pressure, a force. It presses against the ears, against the thoughts, against the soul. He began to imagine the silence as a living entity, something ancient and predatory, something that fed on awareness. In that suffocating void, he realized that silence could scream louder than any sound ever could. After what might have been moments or millennia, he understood why this method of torment was so devastating. The Necrons did not inflict suffering with violence. They let the prisoner's own brain destroy itself. They weaponized the human psychological need for sound, interaction, validation, and meaning. They reduced the rich sensory world of a living being into a starvation chamber of the soul. In that isolation, the prisoner did not merely feel imprisoned. He felt erased. The mind, starving for stimulus, began to devour itself, fragmenting into scattered memories and fading identity. And though his body remained intact, suspended in perfect preservation, his consciousness was dissolving like sand in unseen hands. This was the first stage of Necron torture, not breaking the bones, but breaking the mind's relationship with reality. Once isolation fractured the mind, the Necrons began their next step, systematic memory extraction. It did not look like torture in any conventional sense. There were no spikes, no chains, no physical harm. Instead, filaments of pale green energy slid into neural pathways, threading through synapses like a surgeon's scalpel. Every memory, every thought, every emotional imprint became data to be examined. He could feel the threads pulling, delicate and inexorable, unraveling the knots of his consciousness, separating pieces of himself with mechanical precision. He tried to resist, but resistance was meaningless. The mind is plastic, but not infinite. Each memory pulled weakened the next. First, trivial recollections disappeared. What he had eaten for breakfast, the sound of his own voice, the feel of morning sun on his face. Then, the personal, intimate fragments followed. His mother's laughter, the touch of his brother, the smell of rain after fire. Memories that defined his humanity were siphoned away, leaving only skeletal outlines of what he once was. It was not pain that struck him, it was absence. And then came the distortions. Memories were not merely removed, they were modified. Faces warped, voices twisted, timelines reversed. He recalled his childhood home, but the windows were black holes. He remembered a friend, but their voice became a grotesque echo. The Necrons were not content with mere extraction. They were analysts, probing the mind for patterns, observing reactions, cataloging emotional responses. The prisoner could not trust even his own memory. Reality itself became suspect because the things he remembered were no longer his own. Identity began to erode. Without memory, who was he? A soldier without recollection of rank, a human without past, a being without definition. The brain clung desperately to fragments, but they slipped through fingers that no longer seemed his. Names, faces, achievements, failures, everything that anchored a person's sense of self were systematically unstitched. He felt his personality peeling away, layer by layer, until he was nothing but awareness in a void. Awareness without reference. Awareness without meaning. The process had a rhythm, a precision. The Necron constructs glided silently along the sarcophagi, pausing at intervals to monitor neural reactions. If a memory resisted extraction, the threads would linger, probing deeper until the mind yielded. Sometimes, memories were deliberately corrupted before removal. A tender moment replaced with fear, a comforting image replaced with dread. It was a psychological method of torture beyond comprehension, because the victim could not even identify what was lost or why it hurt. The mind's own library became its executioner. Occasionally, he would catch glimpses of his former self in fleeting flashes, snapshots of who he had been, but they felt alien, like someone else's life he had been forced to inhabit. He tried to clutch these fragments, but they dissolved instantly, leaving a hollow ache. Emotions became unreliable. Grief, anger, joy, and love were scrambled signals. The human brain was never designed to endure this level of erasure, and yet the Necrons remained indifferent. Meticulously observing, cataloging, and refining. There was no mercy, there was no cruelty, there was only analysis. With identity fading, the prisoner became vulnerable to suggestion. The Necrons could introduce faint impressions into his fractured consciousness. Memories that were not his own, commands that felt instinctual, subtle manipulations of perception. He could no longer distinguish self from implanted thought, memory from fabrication. Every attempt to ground himself failed. The mind, once a fortress, had become a sieve. The prisoner could sense the manipulation, but had no tools to resist it. It was a terror beyond pain, a terror of self-loss. The long-term effect was devastating. When memories were extracted or corrupted, the prisoner's reactions became unpredictable, even to himself. He might cry at a memory he never lived, or feel numb at a loss that was orchestrated. Cognitive functions slowed. Emotional resilience collapsed. He felt alien to his own body, foreign to the experiences that once defined him. The Necron prison was not merely emptying a mind. It was creating a state of perpetual disorientation, a living experiment in dissolving what it meant to be human. By the time he reached the final stage of this method, he was no longer the person who had entered the tomb. Memory corrosion had stripped him of identity, leaving awareness alone, a fragile, flickering consciousness drifting in the void. He could recall fragments, but they were shadows, unreliable and inconsistent. Every thought carried uncertainty. Every reaction was provisional. He understood at last that this was the ultimate horror. The Necrons did not need to kill the body because erasing the mind was infinitely worse. To be alive, yet robbed of past, purpose, and self. To exist as a consciousness without anchor in the universe. This was their silent, unthinkable perfection. And he knew, with icy certainty, that those who entered these tombs never truly survived. They were catalogued, dissected, and left to endure eternity as empty shells of what they once were. After memory corrosion and identity breakdown, the next stage began, forcing the prisoner to remain fully conscious while their body and mind endured an eternity of observation. There was no release, no sleep, no respite. The Necrons kept the mind awake, alert, aware of every moment, every manipulation, every intrusion. Time became meaningless. The concept of day or night vanished. The prisoner floated in a limbo where existence itself was the torment. Awareness was no longer a gift. It was a weapon. Even when the mind attempted to block the horror, the Necrons would override it. Stasis fields ensured the body remained perfectly preserved, yet the neural interface transmitted endless information streams, forcing the mind to register every pulse, every mechanical adjustment, every subtle shift of energy. The prisoner could not look away, could not close his eyes in relief, could not allow the mind a moment of ignorance. Consciousness was enforced as a prison. Every instant was amplified, elongated, and logged in meticulous detail. This stage was designed to sever the connection between perception and comfort. Normally, humans could find solace in routine, in small details, in the passage of time. None of these anchors existed here. The Necrons replaced familiarity with relentless scrutiny. Each thought, each twitch of attention was recorded. The prisoner could feel the steady pulse of the tomb's systems as if they were beating inside his head. He could sense the hum of energy fields, the subatomic rearrangements of the sarcophagi, the invisible tendrils probing his neural tissue. There was no escape from consciousness because every neuron was awake, every synapse exposed. He tried to imagine death, but the Necrons denied it. The body was sustained with perfect artificial systems, every organ functioning, every vital sign maintained. Pain was optional, but mortality was forbidden. He could not close the eyes of the mind. He could not surrender. The horror was not physical agony. It was the understanding that he would remain awake, aware, sentient, forever, while his mind was slowly catalogued, corrupted, and observed. Every fraction of existence became a test, an experiment, a demonstration of eternal endurance. Sleep, dreaming, unconsciousness, all were illusions removed. The mind could not drift, could not rest, could not hide. Even hallucinations, born from isolation and memory erosion, were controlled, subtly influenced, monitored. The prisoner's own imagination was weaponized, manipulated, fed back into neural circuits in cycles of endless repetition. Moments of apparent relief were immediately replaced with fresh sensory assaults, mental probes, or distorted recollections. The mind became a hall of mirrors, reflecting pain, confusion, and terror infinitely. The prisoner began to feel his own self-awareness fracturing. Awareness remained, but the sense of I splintered into fragments. He could track his thoughts, yet they seemed foreign. He could perceive his memories, yet they were unreliable. The concept of continuity dissolved. Without memory, without rest, without control, the consciousness of the prisoner became a loop, observing, recording, processing, but never resolving. There was no past, no future, only an eternal present of absolute exposure. Over time, he began to question what it meant to exist. The Necrons had removed not only comfort, identity, and memory, but also the ability to anchor oneself to reality. Every perception could be manipulated. Every sensation could be faked. Every thought could be catalogued, distorted, or deleted. The prisoner was simultaneously everything and nothing, fully aware, yet incapable of authentic experience. He could think, yet the contents of thought were no longer wholly his own. Consciousness itself had become both the chain and the cage. The terror of eternal awareness is subtle but devastating. Most humans can endure pain, fear, hunger, or confinement because eventually moments end. But here, nothing ended. There was no interruption. The prisoner could anticipate nothing, resolve nothing, forget nothing. Even hope, the most resilient human instinct, became a weapon turned against him because the Necrons denied closure. Hope was teased, then stripped away. Every attempt to adapt or survive mentally was catalogued and undone. The mind was trapped in an unending loop of forced perception and enforced helplessness. Eventually, the prisoner realized the true scope of the Necron design. This was not a dungeon or a torture chamber in any human sense. It was a laboratory of eternity, where awareness itself was measured, refined, and manipulated. Pain was irrelevant. Death was irrelevant. Identity was irrelevant. Only consciousness remained, and the Necrons, cold and unfeeling, wielded it like a scalpel. He understood that even if the body remained whole, even if he retained the ability to think, he was already gone. A living mind in eternal stasis, catalogued, dissected, and haunted by the incomprehensible perfection of immortal machinery. The horror was not in what they did to him. It was in the unescapable truth. He would endure forever, fully aware, endlessly conscious, and utterly alone. The survivor's voice trembled as he spoke, though no one was there to hear him, but the echoes of his own mind. His body had been freed from the tomb, but his soul remained trapped, scarred beyond repair. He described waking in darkness, suspended in the cold embrace of stasis fields, his limbs inert while his thoughts ran unchecked. He could not sleep, could not scream, could not even close his eyes to escape. The mind, he whispered, was the first to suffer and the last to be freed. He recalled the green filaments probing his memories, extracting, corrupting, and dissecting every fragment of who he had been. Childhood laughter became static. Names, faces, and voices, everything familiar, twisted into grotesque echoes. Identity slipped like water through his fingers. At first, he thought he could cling to his sense of self, but the more he resisted, the more the Necrons observed, catalogued, and unmade him. By the time they were done, he felt hollow, like a shadow inhabiting his own body. He spoke of isolation, the suffocating silence that pressed against him, more palpable than any physical restraint. Without sound, the brain became a predator upon itself. Thoughts looped endlessly, hallucinations fed upon memories, and reality fractured. The survivor could no longer trust his senses or his mind. He was left alone with his thoughts, and his thoughts were not his own. Hours became years, and minutes became eternity, until he could not distinguish between time that passed and time that was imposed upon him. Even after rescue, the survivor's ordeal did not end. He described seeing other prisoners, souls trapped in stasis, floating in their chambers, conscious but unreachable. He could not hear their screams, nor could they hear his. He could only feel the weight of their presence, like ghosts tethered to a machine. and in his dreams, he returned to the tomb. Green light, sterile walls, the probes threading into his mind. Sleep offered no relief, only replayed terror. Freedom was a physical illusion. The mind remained imprisoned. Emotion came in bursts of uncontrollable grief and terror. He could not form coherent memories of his life prior to capture because every recollection had been tainted or removed. He cried, not for himself, but for the people he had loved, for the family he could no longer recall, for the soldier he had once been. The horror of Necron imprisonment was not just in survival, but in the erasure of humanity. He was alive, but his essence, his story, his very self, had been catalogued, analyzed, and torn apart in silent, eternal dissection. He warned that the mind is a fragile thing when subjected to perfect, impersonal observation. The Necrons do not need to torture physically. The mind, left to endure isolation, manipulation, and endless consciousness, becomes its own executioner. He tried to describe the sensation of being fully awake, yet powerless, of knowing you exist, but having no agency, no control over what thoughts were real or fabricated. Every attempt to resist was observed, noted, catalogued, and countered by a force that did not feel, could not care, and could never err. Finally, he confessed the truth that haunted him above all else. Even in the outside world, he was never truly free. The tomb followed him in every waking moment. Green light lingered in the corners of his vision. The silence of stasis pressed upon him in crowded streets. Every conversation, every movement, every fleeting sense of normalcy was tainted by memories of the unescapable eternity imposed upon his mind. He wept, not for pain, but for the understanding that the Necrons had won not by killing, but by forcing a consciousness to endure perfection without end. The horror, he whispered, is that even survival can be a death worse than the tomb itself, an unending echo of silence, isolation, and stolen selfhood that no human could endure and still call themselves whole. The Necrons do not hate. They do not revel in suffering. They do not seek vengeance or satisfaction in destruction. Their cruelty is not cruelty in any human sense. It is precision, logic, and purpose. To them, pain is irrelevant. Emotions are irrelevant. Mortality is irrelevant. The prisoner, the body, the mind, none of it matters except as data. The Necrons catalog, dissect, and analyze existence itself, and in doing so, they inadvertently inflict horrors that surpass human understanding. Their inhuman perfection becomes the weapon. Where a human torturer relies on fear, pain, and control, the Necron relies on method and observation. Isolation, memory extraction, endless awareness. These are not intended to break a prisoner's body. They are designed to study the mind under extreme conditions. And yet, from this clinical procedure emerges something far more terrifying: a living consciousness, stripped of its anchor in reality, stripped of identity, stripped of hope. The human mind cannot endure this level of impersonal perfection without fracturing. To the Necrons, the mind is a machine, the body a vessel, and consciousness a dataset. Humans experience suffering, fear, and despair because these are meaningful within our emotional framework. The Necrons do not share this framework. They do not value joy or grief. They do not comprehend guilt, empathy, or compassion. But by imposing their clinical logic on biological beings, they create suffering of a kind no human mind was designed to survive. The horror is not intentional. It is emergent from their perfection. This perfection extends beyond the prisoner. Every system, every stasis chamber, every probe is optimized to measure, to observe, to maintain the integrity of the mind while extracting data. There is no mistake, no oversight, no pause. The prisoner's body is preserved in pristine condition, yet the consciousness is unmoored, drifting in endless cycles of observation. The Necron's logic is absolute, and in that absoluteness, humanity is obliterated. Pain is unnecessary because identity is the first casualty. In essence, the Necron's cruelty is a philosophical statement as much as a method. They do not kill because death would be an error. They do not harm physically because the body is irrelevant. They do not speak because words imply meaning. What they do is enforce eternity. Eternal awareness, eternal observation, eternal dismantling of the self. And in that process, the human concept of suffering is magnified to unimaginable extremes. It is not suffering inflicted, it is suffering realized, inevitable, and total. Humans imagine monsters as beings that hate, that desire revenge, that act with intent. The Necrons defy that understanding. Their monstrosity lies in indifference. They do not act with emotion, yet their actions produce terror beyond comprehension. The mind endures agony not because it is targeted with malice, but because the instruments of perfection do not account for human frailty. Consciousness is observed, preserved, and manipulated in ways that render hope, resistance, and identity meaningless. The philosophy of their cruelty is simple. The universe is data, and life is input. The Necrons do not torture in the human sense, but in stripping away emotion, memory, and selfhood, they create a system of suffering that is beyond vengeance, beyond malice, beyond understanding. The horror for the prisoner is existential. One survives physically, yet loses all that makes survival meaningful. Awareness remains, but the self is gone. Life is sustained, yet the essence of life is eradicated. In the hands of beings who care for nothing but observation, perfection becomes a terror that humans cannot comprehend. And those who enter their tombs do not merely face death, but the quiet annihilation of everything that makes them human. As the survivor's voice faltered, he described a truth that no human could have imagined. Some prisoners are never freed. Their bodies remain preserved in stasis, perfect and untouched, yet their minds are trapped in an unending cycle of awareness. Time has no meaning, and death is denied. They do not scream, yet consciousness screams eternally. The tomb is not a cage, not a dungeon, not a battlefield. It is a machine that converts life into perpetual observation. Escape is impossible. Survival is a sentence worse than annihilation. He recounted glimpses of other minds within the tombs, floating, aware, conscious, but unreachable. They are shadows of themselves, present yet absent, observing their own imprisonment without hope. He described their eyes opening in his memories, yet seeing nothing. Their minds were catalogued, analyzed, and broken into fragments that could not reform. Even when he was physically removed, he felt the weight of their presence, a psychic residue that pressed upon him. They were alive, yet dead in every sense that mattered. The survivor explained that the green light of the tombs haunted him. It lingered at the edge of his vision, even in bright sunlight. Shadows moved unnaturally in his peripheral sight. Sounds were subtly distorted, echoing in ways that mimicked the silence of stasis. Sleep was no refuge. In dreams, he returned to the tombs repeatedly. Every probe, every filament, every silent evaluation replayed in terrifying precision. The Necrons' influence was not confined to the physical prison. It extended into perception, into memory, into consciousness itself. The mind could not escape what the body had endured. He spoke of the futility of resistance. Every thought, every attempt to reclaim identity or sanity was anticipated and countered by the Necron's impersonal design. There was no malice, only perfect observation and meticulous logic. The horror was existential. It was not pain, not fear, not death, but the understanding that survival alone had become the weapon. He lived, yet he was gone. He thought, yet thought was stripped of meaning. He remembered, yet memory was unreliable. Humanity was extinguished without violence. And then came the final revelation, one that chilled him more than any stasis or probe. The Necrons do not merely catalog or study. They preserve. They maintain consciousness indefinitely. Prisoners are kept aware, intact, and unyielding for eons. The universe could end, stars could die, galaxies collapse, but those minds would endure, trapped, conscious, and silent. Eternity itself becomes a prison. Mortality is irrelevant. Time offers no mercy. Death is a reprieve denied, leaving only the mind's slow unraveling in perfect observation. He realized that the ultimate cruelty of the Necrons is their indifference. No human hatred, no sadistic intent, no desire to see suffering, just the impartial application of perfection. They do not kill because they do not need to. They do not harm because harm is inefficient. They do not listen, do not speak, do not feel, and yet the consequence of their efficiency is horror beyond comprehension. To endure a lifetime is finite. To endure eternity under perfect observation is infinite. Consciousness itself becomes a tormentor, and sanity a fragile illusion. As the survivor finished his account, he whispered a truth that would linger in any listener's mind. The real terror of the Necron tombs is not in what they do, but in what they allow to continue. The prisoner's body may move, breathe, even be rescued, but the mind remains imprisoned. Memory, identity, and hope are stripped away, leaving only endless awareness, the silent scream of existence, and the cold certainty that there is no escape, not from the tomb, not from the mind, not from eternity itself. Some who enter these crypts live on for ages, catalogued and observed, yet never truly alive. And if you think death is the ultimate end, think again, because the Necrons have perfected something far worse: life without freedom, consciousness without end, and a horror that no human soul was ever meant to endure.